Hello and welcome back to Tort Town. So, a few weeks later than I hoped, but yeah, term was a bit busy. Anyway, you went for multiple sufficient causes, and understandably that is the most difficult to wrap your head around. But it's actually, hopefully, fairly straightforward once you realise that what the courts are doing is drawing a distinction based on what they feel will achieve justice on the facts of the case. And to do that, the courts have drawn a distinction between subsequent events which are tortious and subsequent events which are non-tortious. Okay? So, cast your mind back. So, multiple sufficient causes is where you are injured in some way. Okay, so let's say we've got this van comes along and knocks over this person. Okay, and they are injured. So let's say they've got a broken leg. Okay, so they have this broken leg, but then so they're very unlucky. Okay, another event occurs which damages the leg and let's say causes it to be amputated. So very much like the decision in Baker versus Willoughby. So whether the original defendant, so the person who causes the original injury, will continue to be liable for the harm that they originally caused, so the broken leg, and the sort of loss of amenities, the hobbling around, the pain and so on. The question is, will they remain liable when some other sort of subsequent event has come along which would have been sufficient to cause the original injury, but actually sort of supersedes it and makes the injury much worse? And the court's approach is to say, well, it depends on whether that subsequent injury was caused as a result of negligence or as a result of some non-negligent occurrence. So if it was caused as a result of negligence, so we've got our chap again crossing the road and hit this time by a different driver. There we go. And sadly, ultimately, has to have the leg amputated. Okay, so the injury is much worse. Okay, so it's a subsequent tortious occurrence. Okay, both drivers have been negligent. And here what the courts say is that the second tortfeasor, okay, is only liable for the extent to which they make the injury worse, because we have this general principle of tort law which says that a defendant takes their victim as they find them. So this may be familiar from the eggshell skull rule. Okay, so if you injure somebody who has a weak skull, then you're liable for the fact that you cause greater damage than you would have sort of expected to have caused somebody who didn't have a thin skull. Well, this principle that we take our victim as we find them applies where your victim is already damaged. Okay, so here they're only liable for the extent to which they make them worse. So let's say you damage a item of furniture in college. Okay, if it's a brand new table, okay, you're going to have to probably pay the full price for damaging the item. Okay, if it's a sort of fairly old and tatty table, you'd probably only be liable for the cost that it's worth now. Okay, so yeah, after the sort of depreciation of time and so on. Well, it's the same with people. So this driver of this little van is only going to be liable for making the injury worse. Okay, they're not going to be liable for sort of damaging a perfect leg. They're going to be liable for the amputation of an already damaged leg. The court held in Baker versus Willoughby that the original tortfeasor, so the person who sort of injured the leg to begin with, they will remain liable for the sort of the effect of their tort. So they'd be liable for, let's say, the guy before he was hit by the second vehicle would have had a limp for the rest of his life. And let's say you get, I don't know, £1,000 worth of damage for that. Well, you're still going to get that £1,000 worth of damage. And the court felt that this was the just thing to do in these circumstances. Okay, so the original tortfeasor remains liable. Okay, they have to pay for the damage that they caused, the injury that they caused, and the subsequent tortfeasor, well, they will be liable for the extent to which they make things worse. Okay, they don't have to pay, they don't have to cover the sort of damage by the original person. This was helpful to the claimant in Baker, because you remember in that case the second defendant were armed robbers and they couldn't be found. Okay, so if the court had said no, the subsequent tortfeasor pays the full extent of the damages, okay, the claimant in that case would have got nothing. But as the court held that the original tortfeasor, who'd sort of just injured the leg and not done the sort of worst damage, remains liable, the claimant could still get the compensation for that injury. So the key thing to remember with sort of subsequent multiple sufficient sort of occurrences, where you've got sort of a second event which could have caused the original damage, okay, if that subsequent event is tortious, the second defendant, so the subsequent defendant, will only be liable for the extent to which they made it worse, and the first defendant remains liable for the injury that they have caused in the first place. But the courts have said that where the subsequent event, okay, so here we've got our little man, okay, he's already been knocked over, he's walking across the road again with his sort of broken leg, okay, where the subsequent event which makes matters worse is non-tortious, okay, well, then the first defendant's liability, okay, will cease at that point, okay. So let's say we've got our chap crossing the road and they are attacked by a small but extremely vicious bear which bites off their leg. Well, in this sort of case, okay, where the subsequent event which makes matters worse is non-tortious, the court held in Jobling versus Associated Dairies that the original defendant's liability for the injury they caused will sort of cease at the point at which the subsequent non-tortious occurrence overtakes the original injury, and the first defendant's, the original defendant's liability will cease at that point. Why is this? Well, that's because in Jobling versus Associated Dairies, the courts applied a separate principle of law, okay, which is applied in relation to calculating damages, which is the principle of the vicissitudes of life. So when you're injured by a tortfeasor, so let's say our chap gets injured and his leg is sort of broken, he ends up with a limp, okay, well, he's not going to be he's going to be less mobile, okay, but the courts, and that's going to affect him all his life, but the courts take into account when assessing damages, they get an actuarial calculation from expert witnesses to say, well, to what extent would a person's life have been affected by other sort of non-tortious events throughout the course of their life. So let's say as we get older, we get a bit slower. So if you injure sort of a young person's leg, okay, they're going to sort of have reduced mobility. But as we all get older, our mobility tends to reduce anyway. So the courts would sort of deduct a bit off the damages rather than saying, okay, you've been deprived of a healthy leg for your entire life, so we're going to give you this much. Well, the courts would sort of deduct some money from that amount to take into effect as we get older, our legs get a bit worse more generally. Okay, so the courts say with these sort of subsequent non-tortious occurrences, okay, so these natural vicissitudes of life, okay, we do take those into account in calculating damages. Okay, so where you have a and usually that's a matter of speculation based on actuarial calculations. But where some sort of vicissitude of life, or like, I don't know, in jobbling it was sort of getting a disease, or in our case being attacked by a bear, some sort of non-tortious occurrence does occur, well, then the courts will take that account into calculating damages. You'll notice in both Barker and jobbling, this in both these cases, the subsequent event, the second tort, and the developing of the disease both happened before trial. So the courts said, okay, in jobbling we discount to take into account the vicissitudes of life. Well, here we have a vicissitude of life developing this disease, so we're going to discount for that as well. So in jobbling, they said, okay, well, the defendants who caused you the original injury, that original sort of damage to the back has now been superseded by this disease, and that disease is now causing you this lack of mobility, this joblessness that you're suffering. So we're going to say that we are going to stop your damages at that point at which you suffered this disease, and because now your injury has been overtaken by the disease. So with multiple sufficient causes, where you have a claimant who's been harmed by a defendant, and then because they're extremely unlucky, they suffer a subsequent injury caused either by the tort of another person or by a non-tortious occurrence, which is sufficient to cause the same harm that the claimant was already suffering, whether that original defendant remains liable to pay damages for the harm they originally caused, even though the injury they've caused has now been overtaken by a subsequent injury. Okay? Whether they will be liable depends on whether the subsequent event was tortious or non-tortious. Okay, so that's really what you've got to look for in cases of multiple sufficient causes. Okay? Was the second sufficient cause, was that tortious or non-tortious? And it's pretty straightforward. If it was tortious, okay, so we've got the second van, then the original defendant remains liable for the amount of injury they caused, the damage to the leg, okay? And because the second defendant, okay, the guy in the second van, takes his victim as he finds them, he only pays for the extra damage that he's caused. If you're unlucky enough to suffer a vicissitude of life, okay, after you've been injured by a defendant, okay, the courts say, well, the original defendant's liability will stop at that point in time, so that where the injury they caused is overtaken by the subsequent sufficient natural cause. And they say that's because in calculating damages, we take account of the natural vicissitudes of life. The fact that you voted for this one to be Tort Town is understandable. It does seem, because you do have the courts here applying two different rules in what seem to be very similar circumstances. The only difference is whether the subsequent event was tortious or non-tortious. In one case, the claimant seems to, does indeed get less compensation. Is this fair? It's really the courts trying to do what they think is just on the facts of the case, and you can disagree whether you think that is just or not. If the overriding aim of tort law is to provide compensation, okay, well then perhaps in the jobbling type cases of non-tortious subsequent occurrences, the courts should have said no, the original defendant remains liable. But compensation is just one aim of tort law. We also have the principle of corrective justice, under which a defendant should only be liable for the harm they can be said to have caused. And the courts in jobbling interpreted that, saying, well, we take account of subsequent vicissitudes of life, and which aren't caused by the defendant, and we deduct from the amount of damages a defendant has to pay sums which take account of these subsequent occurrences. And in the case of Jobling, that led them to say that, well, okay, there's been this subsequent event. Usually we sort of guesstimate these subsequent vicissitudes of life. Here we we know that the person has sort of subsequently lost greater function in their leg due to a non-tortious occurrence, which isn't the fault of the defendant. So we're going to say the defendant should sort of cease to be liable, at the point at which what they did can be said to have ceased to have influence upon the sort of claimant's condition. You can see that the courts are trying to balance these things. Whether they strike the right balance is for you to decide, based on your view of the aims of tort law. So I hope that's enlightened you a little bit about this rather tricky case of multiple sufficient causes. The reason it's tricky is because of these deeper sort of debates going on behind, and the court's really grappling with what is just on the facts of these cases.